There are drawings that capture beauty, a face, a landscape, a moment of fleeting joy. They are a mirror held up to the world, reflecting what we see. And then, there are drawings that capture something else entirely. Drawings that serve as a window opening onto a place that is not meant to be seen. A place where the light is wrong, where the proportions are twisted, and where the shadows are watching. We call it art, expression, imagination, a safe way to explore the darkness. But what if the act of creation is not a statement, but a conversation? And what if the thing on the other end of that conversation is not human? A piece of art is a confession. It is the artist revealing their most intimate, guarded, and sometimes their most broken inner truths. But what happens when the confession isn't theirs? What happens when the hand holding the charcoal or the brush is merely a vessel, a tool being used by something else to carve its own image into our world? History is littered with these fragments, the final, frantic works of artists consumed by an obsession, the last terrifying testament before the silence. We look at these pieces from the safety of a gallery or a museum, and we call it madness. We call it a breakdown. But what if it isn't a breakdown? What if it's a breakthrough? A terrifying final moment of clarity when the artist at last sees the world as it truly is. A moment when they finally see the thing that has been staring back at them from the mirror, from the canvas, from the dark space under their bed. Tonight, we are not looking at art. We are looking at evidence. We are opening 3 case files from the dark intersection of obsession and the abyss. 3 artists separated by time and distance who all shared one terrifying gift. They captured their own end. They didn't just see the darkness, they gave it a face. And in one case, the artist drew this the night before he died. Our first case file begins in 1996. The setting is the Ashworth College of Art and Design, an isolated modernist campus in upstate New York. It was a place of intense creative pressure, known for its demanding programs and its long, brutal winters. The subject is Julian Price, 21 years old, a 4th-year painting student. By all accounts, Julian was a prodigy. His professors called him singularly talented, a technical master. His work, up until the winter of '96, was known for its startling, near-photographic realism. He painted portraits. He captured not just the likeness of his subjects, but a sense of their weight, their history. His work felt heavy. But Julian was also reclusive. He was a classic brooding artist, the kind of young man who lived in his own head, who took his work not just seriously, but personally. He didn't just paint, he seemed to channel his subjects. This, perhaps, was the fatal flaw. In the fall of 1996, Julian isolated himself further. He dropped all but one of his classes, he stopped showing up at the cafeteria, he moved out of the shared dorms and into a single occupancy room on the top floor of Tower C, a cold, concrete building known for its unsettling quiet and its history of student tragedies. He told his one remaining friend, a photography student named Sarah, that he had found his final thesis project. He called it Reflections. His new obsession was a large antique mirror he had bought at a local antique shop. He'd had it hauled up to his room where it took up an entire wall.
His project, he explained, was a series of self-portraits, painted not from a photograph, but from life, from his own reflection. At first, Sarah was supportive. It was typical, if somewhat cliché, art school intensity. But as the winter deepened, Julian began to change. The first sign was the art itself. Sarah would stop by his room. He'd often refuse to answer, the door locked. But when he did, the room was a mess. The air was thick and toxic with the smell of turpentine, linseed oil, and something else. A cold, metallic, almost electric smell like ozone. And the drawings. The walls were covered in them. Dozens, then hundreds of charcoal sketches. All of them, him. But they were wrong. The first sketches were classic Julian, perfect, technical, sad. But the new ones were different, distorted. The proportions were deliberately, agonizingly incorrect. His eyes in the drawings were too wide, staring. His mouth was stretched, not in a scream, but in a smile that was too broad for his face. His neck, in some, was elongated, almost swan-like. They were grotesque. "It's a new style, Julian?" Sarah asked him, trying to sound encouraging. He was pale. He hadn't slept in what looked like days. His fingers were black with charcoal dust. He just stared at her, as if she were a stranger. "He doesn't like the old style," Julian whispered. "Who doesn't?" Julian turned to the massive mirror. "Him, the one in the glass. He's particular." This was the shift, the moment the investigation pinpoints as the beginning of the end. Julian no longer believed he was painting himself. He believed he was painting something else that was wearing his face. He told Sarah that the man in the mirror was no longer his reflection. It was, he claimed, a different man who would only appear in the deep hours of the night between 3 and 4 a.m. He said the man would stand behind him, whispering, guiding his hand. "He says the eyes are wrong," Julian told her, his voice frantic. "He says I'm not capturing the real expression, the real him." Sarah, now genuinely terrified, reported her concerns to the resident advisor. They noted Julian for a wellness check, but when they knocked, he simply yelled that he was fine and working. The last time Sarah saw him alive was on December 4th, 1996. She brought him a tray of food from the cafeteria. He opened the door a crack. His face was emaciated. He didn't look at her. He just looked at the hallway behind her. "He knows you're out here. He doesn't like visitors. He says he's almost ready. My final piece. It's almost done." He slammed the door. That was the last conversation. For 2 days, silence. No one saw him. No music came from his room. The RA slipped notes under his door. They remained on the floor. On the morning of December 7th, the smell was unmistakable. Not food, not turpentine. It was the sharp, coppery, unforgettable smell of death, masked by the chemical tang of oil paint. The RA used his master key. The chain was on. They called campus security. When they forced the door open, the room was immaculate. Clean, organized, a stark contrast to the chaos Sarah had described. The bed was made, the floors were swept. There was no food, no trash. The only mess was the art. The walls were covered, floor to ceiling, in the distorted self-portraits. Hundreds of them, tacked up in a dizzying, overlapping collage. A silent, screaming audience of Julian's own twisted faces. And Julian was at his desk. He was slumped forward, his head resting on his sketchbook. He was cold. He had been dead for at least 36 hours. The coroner would later rule it a massive, stress-induced cerebral aneurysm. A blood vessel in his brain had quite simply exploded. Natural causes. Case closed. But it's the scene that the RA and the police walked into. That's the part that became a dark campus legend. That's the part that the official report leaves out. The room, as we said, was clean, but it was unfinished. On his main easel, a large, fresh canvas was propped up. It was a painting, a self-portrait, but it wasn't a sketch. It was a fully rendered oil painting, the paint still wet. It was the final piece he had promised. It was a masterpiece. It depicted Julian himself in agonizing, hyper-realistic detail, slumped over his desk, the exact position he was found in. The painting showed the back of his head, his hand still clutching a piece of charcoal. But he was not alone. Standing behind him in the painting, one long, pale hand resting gently on Julian's shoulder, was a figure. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in what looked like an old 1970s-style suit. But its face, the painting was precise everywhere else, but the face of the figure was a smooth, dark, featureless void, a polished, shadowy absence. The police, baffled, logged it as a morbid vinyl painting, a coincidence. But then there was the campus security footage. This was 1996. The CCTV was grainy, black and white, and unreliable. But the camera in the hallway of Tower C, Floor 8, was operational. The police reviewed the tapes. For the 72 hours leading up to the discovery of Julian's body, the footage was static. It showed an empty hallway, Sarah knocking, the RA slipping notes, the police breaking in. No one else. No one had entered Julian's room, and no one had left. He was, by all accounts, completely alone. This is where the official investigation ended, but for us, this is where it begins. We dug into the Ashworth College archives. We looked for the history of that specific dorm room, Tower C, Room 812. And we found him, Michael Vance, a graduate student in comparative literature. In 1974, 22 years earlier, Michael Vance had vanished from that exact room. He left his wallet, his keys, his dissertation. He just disappeared. He was never seen again. We found his student ID photo from the 1974 yearbook. He was tall, he was thin, and he was wearing a dark, ill-fitting suit. The investigation never connected the two events. To them, Julian Price died of an aneurysm while painting a self-portrait. But to those who saw the painting, the truth was clear. Julian hadn't been painting a self-portrait at all. He had been painting a double portrait. He had, with his final act, captured his subject and his artist. The man in the mirror had finished his masterpiece.
And he had, at last, been seen. Our second case file moves us from the creative intensity of a college dorm to the supposed safety of the American suburbs. We move to 2009, a quiet, master-planned community in central Ohio. The subjects are the Miller family, Mark, Karen, and their 9-year-old son, Eli. They were, by every metric, the perfect American family. Mark was an engineer, Karen a part-time nurse. Eli was a quiet, bright, and intensely imaginative child. He loved to draw. His parents, proud and supportive, kept his artwork taped to every available surface. The refrigerator was a collage of superheroes, dinosaurs, and spaceships.
They lived in a new-build house on a peaceful cul-de-sac. It was, as Karen later told police, their forever home. The first sign that something was wrong began, as it so often does, with nightmares. In the fall of 2009, Eli suddenly began waking up, screaming. He would run to his parents' room, his face pale with terror, claiming there was something in his room. Mark and Karen did what any loving, rational parent would do. They checked the closet. They looked under the bed. They bought a new, monster-themed nightlight. "See, Eli," Mark would say, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark. "Nothing there. Just your toys. It was just a bad dream." But Eli's terror didn't fade. It focused. He stopped sleeping. He would be found in the morning asleep on the hallway landing, a small, huddled shape just outside his own bedroom door. He began to refuse to be in his room alone. And his drawings changed. The dinosaurs and superheroes vanished. Eli began to draw one thing and one thing only: his bedroom. He drew it over and over with a 9-year-old's obsessive precision. He drew the blue walls, the baseball lamp, the window with the oak tree outside, and in every single drawing, he drew a dark, chaotic, scribbled shadow under his bed. "That's the monster, honey," his mother Karen said, trying to be supportive, trying to use the language of therapy. "What does it look like?" "It doesn't look," Eli said, his eyes fixed on the paper. "It watches." His parents, now genuinely concerned, took him to a child psychologist. The diagnosis was predictable: acute night terrors, possibly a symptom of anxiety from starting a new school year. The advice was to reaffirm the safety of his environment and give him tools to express his feelings. The tool he chose was his sketchbook. The drawings became more detailed. The scribbled shadow was no longer just a scribble. It began to take shape. Eli's drawings, which his parents had collected in a binder, show a terrifying progression. The shadow started to develop limbs. Long, thin, black, spider-like lines. They weren't legs, they were just reaches. They stretched from the shadow, extending towards the open bedroom door, toward the window, toward the small, stick figure Eli he would draw huddled in the bed. He began to add text. At the bottom of a drawing showing a black limb extending from under the bed, Eli had written in shaky block letters, "It doesn't like the light." On another, showing the shape almost entirely filling the space under the bed, he wrote, "It likes the smell of my hair." This, for his parents, was the breaking point. This was no longer imagination, this was something else. Mark, in a fit of frustrated, terrified fatherhood, decided to end it. He went into Eli's room with a toolbox. He and Eli together disassembled the entire bed frame. They pulled the mattress out, the box spring. They laid on the floor with flashlights, shining them into the empty space. "See, Eli?" Mark said, his voice echoing under the bed. "Nothing. Just dust. Just floor." Eli, however, was not looking at the floor. He was staring at the wall behind where the bed had been, at a small, dark, circular grate, an old, unused air return vent that had been covered by the headboard. "He's in there," Eli whispered. "He's just hiding." That night, Mark and Karen put Eli to bed. They taped the vent shut with heavy-duty duct tape. They left the hallway light on. They tucked him in. They told him he was safe. That was the last time they ever saw him. At 7 a.m. the next morning, Karen went to wake Eli for school. The room was empty. The bed was perfectly made. The window was locked from the inside. The duct tape over the vent was untouched. Eli Miller was gone. The police were called. The search was immediate and frantic. The house was torn apart. The neighborhood was canvassed. Police dogs were brought in. They sniffed Eli's pillow, his toys, and they lost the scent at his bedroom door. They could not or would not enter the room. They would whine, bark, and tuck their tails, refusing to cross the threshold. There was no sign of forced entry, no footprints, no ransom note. The house was secure. To police, it was an impossible crime. Eli Miller had, in the middle of the night, vanished from a locked room in a secure house in a safe neighborhood. The investigation stalled. The parents, as is standard procedure, were the primary suspects. They were questioned for hours, polygraphed, they passed. They were just broken. The case went cold. A local tragedy. A 9-year-old boy who had simply ceased to be. But the police missed one piece of evidence, or perhaps they simply didn't know what to do with it. It was Eli's sketchbook. It was on his desk, left open to the last page. This drawing was different from all the others. It wasn't a frantic, terrified scribble. It was a calm, precise diagram. It was a blueprint of his room, drawn from an impossible overhead angle as if he were floating on the ceiling. It showed the bed, the desk, the open door, and under the bed, the shadow. It was no longer bunched up. It was unfurled, a vast, black, ink-blot creature. Its long, thin, dark limbs were stretched out like a flattened spider, reaching across the entire floor plan. One limb was touching the door. One limb was touching the window. One limb was touching the closet. And one was touching the small stick figure Eli lying in the bed. It wasn't a monster under the bed. It was the floor. It was the shadows. It was the room itself. And at the very bottom of the page, scrawled in Eli's trembling 9-year-old handwriting, a final, chilling message. It knows you're looking. This is where the story should end. A heartbreaking, unsolved case. A family destroyed by an unexplainable loss. But it doesn't. This is the part of the investigation that kept us awake. We looked into the property records for that house. As expected, Mark and Karen Miller sold it a year after their son's disappearance. It sat empty for a few years. And then, in 2019, 10 years after Eli vanished, a new family moved in. A family with an 8-year-old daughter named Sophie. We found a Facebook post from Sophie's mother from March of 2020. It was posted to a local community group intended to be humorous. The post read, "My daughter is so creative. Look at this friendly monster she drew that lives under her bed. LOL. Kids have such an imagination." The post included a picture of the drawing. It showed a bed, a small smiling stick figure of a girl sleeping, and under the bed, a dark, scribbled shadow. A shadow with long, thin, black limbs reaching out. The house on the quiet cul-de-sac was hungry again, and the thing that watched was just waiting for a new pair of eyes to see it. Our final case file takes us back in time and across the world to a place where the line between the living and the dead has always been thin. The year is 1893. The setting, an isolated village in the eastern Carpathian foothills. This was a place of deep, dark forests, ancient traditions, and a profound, bone-deep superstition. In this era, before the photograph was commonplace, there was only one way to preserve the memory of a loved one: the memento mori, the painting of the dead. Our subject is Stefan, the village's mourning painter. This was not a job for a regular artist. It was a calling. Stefan was a somber, respected, and deeply private man. His work was not to capture life, but to capture memory. He was invited into the homes of the grieving, often within hours of a passing, to paint the deceased. He would sit with the body in the cold, silent rooms and give the family one last perfect image to hold on to. He was known for his steady hand and his respectful, almost reverent demeanor. He was a man who understood grief, and he was a man who, until his final commission, was not afraid of death. In the brutal winter of 1893, a fever swept through the valley. It took many, but its most tragic victim was Anya, the 12-year-old daughter of the town's wealthy and deeply reclusive landowner. Stefan was summoned to their large, cold, dark estate on the hill. The commission was standard, a portrait of Anya, as she was on her deathbed. He was led to the child's room. It was opulent but cold, the air thick with the smell of lye, lavender, and the faint, sweet, sickening odor of decay. The girl was laid out on her bed, dressed in a white lace gown. Stefan set up his easel, he lit his oil lamps, and he began to paint. From the first stroke, something was wrong. Stefan was a master of his craft, but the girl's face, it was difficult. The light in the room seemed to shift, to play tricks on his eyes. The shadows on her face wouldn't stay still. He painted for 2 days in the heavy, oppressive silence of the death room. The family left him alone. On the second day, he finished. The painting was a technical marvel. He had captured her likeness perfectly, but too perfectly. As he was packing his paints, he looked at the finished portrait. The paint was still wet, and the eyes. He could have sworn he had painted them closed, but now in the dim lamplight, they appeared to be open, just a fraction, and they seemed to be looking not at him, but at the corner of the room. He blamed the fumes, the lack of sleep, the grief in the house. He covered the painting with a cloth, accepted his payment from the grieving father, and left the estate. He never wanted to see the painting or the house again. But the painting did not leave him. He returned to his small, cluttered studio in the village. He tried to work on other commissions, but he couldn't. Every new face he started began to look like Anya. The same pale skin, the same unsettling curve of the lips, the same knowing eyes. He scraped the canvases clean, frantic. He was losing his touch. A week later, the sightings began. It wasn't Stefan who saw her first. It was the villagers. A child playing by the frozen village well ran home screaming, claiming he had seen Anya, the dead girl, standing by the water beckoning to him. An old woman peering out her window at dusk saw a small figure in a white lace gown standing motionless in the snow, staring at the window of Stefan's studio. Stefan became a recluse. The villagers, already suspicious, now whispered that he was cursed, that in painting the dead, he had disturbed something. He locked himself in his studio. He wasn't painting her anymore. He was painting for her. He was an artist possessed, not by a demon, but by a muse. He would be found muttering to the empty room, "Just one more, it's not right yet, the eyes are not right." The fear in the village grew. The sightings of the white girl became more frequent, always closer to Stefan's home. She was no longer just watching. She was waiting. The final act came 3 weeks after the painting was delivered. The village priest, a young pragmatic man, had decided to confront Stefan. He, along with 2 other men, went to the studio. The door was locked. They pounded on it. "Stefan, let us in. This has gone on long enough." There was no reply. But there was a smell. The overpowering chemical smell of oil paint and turpentine, and something else. The same thick, sweet smell from Anya's death room. They broke down the door. The studio was a nightmare. Every canvas was a portrait of Anya, dozens of them, some smiling, some screaming, some with eyes blacked out. They were surrounding a single large canvas on the main easel. This one was different. It was unfinished. It showed the interior of the studio itself, a painting of the room they were currently standing in. In the center of the painting was the girl, Anya. She was standing by the easel, her back to the viewer, and she was smiling. She was looking past the viewer at something in the background. In the painted background, there was a mirror, and in the mirror, a reflection. It was a faint, shadowy outline, the outline of a man. He was hanging from the rafters. The priest, horrified, looked up from the canvas to the rafters of the real studio. Stefan was there. He was hanging from a rope, exactly as depicted in the painting's reflection. He had been dead for days. The official report was suicide by reason of madness. The grieving family, hearing of the horror, had the original portrait of Anya burned. The village, in a fit of superstitious terror, burned Stefan's studio to the ground, destroying all the other paintings. The story was buried. This, again, is where the story should end. A dark, tragic piece of local folklore. But the investigation found a pattern. We spoke to a historian, a doctor of art history from Prague, who has been tracking what he calls a visual mimetic virus. He has been collecting obscure, forgotten, or cursed pieces of art for decades. He sent us a file. In it was a 16th century charcoal sketch from a mad artist in Florence. It showed a chaotic scene. In the margins, in the corner, was a small, pale face. A girl. In it was a damaged glass plate photograph from a 1920s Parisian art house. A group of artists. In the background, out of focus, a woman looks out a window. The same face. A piece of digital art from a forgotten server in Tokyo in 2003. An anonymous artist. A glitch art portrait. The same eyes. The face in Stefan's painting was not Anya's. Anya was just the first victim, the vessel. The thing that Stefan painted, the entity that he captured, has been moving through art for centuries. It is a ghost in the machine, a parasite that doesn't infect a person, but infects creativity. It passes from artist to artist. It doesn't want to be remembered. It doesn't want to rest. It just wants to be seen. And Stefan, in his terrible genius, was the first not only to paint it, but to paint himself as its next victim.
A canvas is a blank space. A sketchbook, a clean page. It is an invitation, a question asked to the void. What do you look like? Julian Price, Eli Miller, Stefan. 3 artists from 3 different worlds.
They were not mad. They were receptive. Their obsession, their talent, their willingness to look was a ritual. It thinned the veil. It weakened the barrier between the world we see and the world that sees us. And the void answered back. These artists weren't just creating, they were transcribing. They were taking dictation from an unseen horror. They gave the darkness a hand to hold the charcoal. They gave it a room to hide in. They gave it a face to wear. And in return, it gave them an ending. We look at these final, chilling drawings, and we call them artifacts. We call them mysteries. We call them the warnings of a mind on the edge. But perhaps they are not warnings at all. Perhaps they are invitations. Perhaps the most terrifying thought of all is that they are not the only ones. That in some dark room, right now, a lonely artist is staring at a blank page, waiting for inspiration. And something is about to give it to them. He didn't just draw his death. He invited it.
Prince of Darkness.